There is a white castle on a cliff in the Bavarian Alps. It rises above a gorge where a cold stream runs far below. Pine forests close in on 3 sides. On a clear morning, its towers are visible from 10 miles away. 6,000 strangers walk through it every summer day. They photograph the throne hall. They stand on the steel bridge above the gorge. They buy postcards of the man who built it. Most of them do not know how the story ends. His name was Ludwig II. He became king at 18. He was not ready. 2 years later, Prussia took his sovereignty. He stopped facing the world. He turned toward Wagner's operas. He turned toward the stone. He spent 17 years building this castle. He filled its walls with painted knights and holy grails. He designed a throne room that would never hold a throne. In 1886, he was declared insane without a single medical examination. He was taken from the castle at 4 in the morning. The next evening, he was found floating in a shallow lake, 40 years old. He spent 17 years building it. He slept in it only 11 nights. What happened on that lake has never been explained. Ludwig grew up inside a story someone else had written. Hohenschwangau Castle, rebuilt by his father Maximilian II in the 1830s, was draped in frescoes of knights, dragons, and the swan knight Lohengrin. The walls of his childhood were not walls, they were stages. By the time the boy was 10, the line between legend and life had already begun to blur. The castle sat on a hill above the Alpsee, in the far south of Bavaria, where the foothills of the Alps rise sharply from green valleys, and the air thins with altitude. Maximilian had purchased the medieval ruin in 1832 and commissioned the architect Domenico Quaglio to rebuild it in the neo-Gothic style. Construction lasted from 1833 to 1837. When it was finished, over 90 murals covered the interior, painted by artists including Lorenzo Quaglio and Moritz von Schwind, depicting the Nibelungen saga, the legend of Parzival, and the story of Lohengrin, the swan knight who arrives in a boat pulled by a white swan to rescue a maiden and defend a kingdom. Swans appeared everywhere, carved into the furniture, painted above the doorways, etched into the stonework. The heraldic animal of the medieval counts of Schwangau, whose successors the Wittelsbachs claimed to be, became the defining image of the house. This was the world Ludwig entered each summer. He and his younger brother, Otto, were brought here from Munich by their parents, King Maximilian II and Queen Marie of Prussia. But the family was not close. Ludwig's mother kept emotional distance. His father, consumed by matters of state, was largely absent from the boys' daily lives. When advisors once suggested that the king might enjoy walking with his eldest son, Maximilian reportedly replied that his son took no interest in what other people told him. Ludwig was left to his tutors, his books, and the painted walls. His education was strict and unrelenting, a rigid schedule of study, physical exercise, and moral instruction designed to prepare a crown prince for the burdens of rule. But Ludwig was drawn to other things. He liked to dress up. He staged puppet theaters. He built imaginary churches and castles from wooden blocks. He read Schiller and absorbed the legends that surrounded him in every room of Hohenschwangau. His mother noted that he took pleasure in play acting and gave away his possessions freely. His governess, Sibylle Meilhaus, became his closest companion in the early years, closer than either parent. He wrote to her long after she left his household. Across Europe, the 1850s were a decade of expanding railways, coal smoke, and industrial acceleration. Bavaria was changing. But inside Hohenschwangau, time moved differently. The murals on the walls did not depict the modern world. They depicted a world of enchanted forests, holy grails, and knights who answered to no parliament. Ludwig absorbed all of it. He did not yet know that the stories were not real. Or perhaps he already knew and did not care. He preferred the company of painted swans. On February 2, 1861, the 15-year-old Crown Prince Ludwig attended a performance of Richard Wagner's Lohengrin at the Munich Court Theatre. The effect was immediate and permanent. 10 months later, he saw Tannhauser, and the obsession deepened. He did not simply admire Wagner's music. He entered it. Wagner was, by 1861, already one of the most controversial figures in European music. Born in Leipzig in 1813, he had spent decades developing a radical vision of opera, what he called the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, in which music, poetry, drama, and visual spectacle would fuse into a single overwhelming experience. His operas were long, emotionally extreme, and built on Germanic and Nordic mythology. They told stories of doomed love, divine punishment, and the search for spiritual purity. For a boy who had spent his childhood surrounded by painted legends, Wagner's music was not simply beautiful. It was a doorway. Lohengrin tells the story of a mysterious knight who appears in a boat drawn by a swan to defend an innocent duchess. He defeats her enemy, marries her, and asks only one thing: that she never asks his name or where he comes from. She eventually breaks the promise. The knight reveals himself as Lohengrin, son of Parsifal, guardian of the Holy Grail. He leaves. The swan returns. The knight disappears across the water. It is a story about a man who cannot be known, a man whose identity must remain hidden to remain powerful. Ludwig, who had grown up in a castle whose walls depicted this exact legend, was shaken by the performance. A member of his father's cabinet later noted that Tannhauser had an almost demoniacal effect on the prince. From that night forward, Ludwig studied Wagner's works with an intensity that bordered on devotion. He was not himself a gifted musician. A piano teacher once noted that the prince lacked a strong ear, but that did not matter. It was not the music alone that consumed him. It was the poetry, the mythology, the worlds Wagner constructed. He found Wagner's compositions at the home of his aunt, the Duchess Ludovica, at Possenhofen, across the lake from Hohenschwangau. He read the libretti. He memorized passages. He began to see himself not just as a future king of Bavaria, but as something closer to a character in one of these operas, a figure of purity, isolation, and higher purpose. In the early 1860s, Europe was accelerating toward a new era of nation-states and industrial power. Prussia was rising. The old order of small German kingdoms was beginning to crack. Parliaments demanded more authority. Monarchs were losing ground. But Ludwig, at 15, was not paying attention to constitutions or alliances. He was listening to Wagner. He was watching a knight vanish across a painted lake. He had found the only world he wanted. On March 10, 1864, King Maximilian II died after a brief illness. Ludwig was 18. He had been studying constitutional law, reading poetry, and dreaming of medieval knights. He was not ready to rule a country. He later wrote that he had been snatched from his books and set on a throne. Death came suddenly. Maximilian had seemed in reasonable health, and no long illness had prepared the court or the country for the transition. The deputation arrived at the palace and found Ludwig. Within hours, the young man who had spent his days reading Schiller and staging puppet theaters was being addressed as Your Majesty. He traveled to Munich to see his dying father. Maximilian's last words to his son, according to one account, carried the weight of a man who understood the burden he was passing on. He expressed a quiet hope that death would come as gently to Ludwig as it had come to him. There was no warmth in the exchange. Father and son had never been close. Ludwig became King of Bavaria at a moment of deep political uncertainty across Central Europe. The German Confederation, a loose collection of 39 sovereign states, was fracturing under the pressure of Prussian ambition. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian minister-president, was in the process of engineering a series of wars designed to unify the German states under Prussian leadership. The Schleswig-Holstein crisis of 1864, which erupted in the very month of Ludwig's accession, saw Prussia and Austria jointly invade Denmark over disputed territories. The old order of small, independent German kingdoms was being dismantled, piece by piece. Bavaria, one of the largest of those kingdoms, now had an 18-year-old at the helm. Ludwig had no political experience. He had no allies in the cabinet. He had not been groomed for statecraft in the way his father had intended. There had simply not been enough time. His education had emphasized duty, but the word had lost its meaning. The Constitution gave him significant powers, but the ministers surrounding him were experienced men who expected obedience to protocol, not vision. Munich, the Bavarian capital, greeted the new king with genuine enthusiasm. Ludwig was tall, reportedly standing at 193 centimeters, with dark hair and striking blue eyes. The women of the court admired him. The public, exhausted by the dour final years of Maximilian's reign, welcomed the youth and energy of a new monarch. But behind the public warmth, the reality was stark. Ludwig had no mentor, no confidant in government, and no interest in the machinery of power. He was a romantic in an age that was rapidly becoming mechanical. Years later, reflecting on that spring, Ludwig wrote plainly about the gap between the throne and the boy who sat on it. He had made a good beginning with his studies, he said. He had not been allowed to finish. He stood at the center of a kingdom unwanted. Within weeks of becoming king, Ludwig sent his private secretary to find Richard Wagner, a man drowning in debts and fleeing creditors across Europe. Wagner initially mistook the envoy for a debt collector. When the two men finally met at the Munich residence, Wagner wept. Ludwig clasped his hand and promised to fund the completion of the ring cycle. He was 19. He believed he had found his purpose. The secretary, a man named Pfistermeister, had been dispatched with a photograph of the young king and a ring set with a ruby. Wagner was living in Stuttgart at the time, hounded by debts accumulated across years of failed productions and personal extravagance. He had been banned from Saxony, expelled from various cities, and was on the edge of ruin. When Pfistermeister finally located him on May 3, 1864, Wagner was suspicious, but the ring was real, and the message was clear. The new King of Bavaria wanted to meet him. The meeting took place at the Munich residence on May 4th. Wagner later described the encounter in a letter to a friend. He wrote that Ludwig was so handsome, so wise, so full of soul, that he feared the young king's life would fade like a divine dream in the vulgar world. Ludwig, for his part, was overwhelmed. He took Wagner's hand and promised that the financial burdens would be lifted, that the great ring cycle would be completed, and performed as Wagner had always intended. The two men talked for hours. Ludwig was 19. Wagner was 51. What followed was one of the most extraordinary acts of artistic patronage in European history. Ludwig settled Wagner's debts, which were enormous. He provided the composer with a villa near the royal palace. He arranged a generous stipend. He ordered that Wagner's operas be staged at the Munich Court Theatre with the finest performers available. For the first time in years, Wagner could work without the constant pressure of financial collapse. The arrangement was, for a brief window, everything both men had wanted: a young king who believed in the transformative power of art, and a composer who finally had the resources to realize his vision. But the arrangement carried a cost that neither man anticipated. Wagner was practical about patronage. He took the money, settled into the villa, and began an open affair with Cosima von Bülow, the wife of his own conductor. Ludwig, who had written to Wagner comparing their bond to the devotion between Lohengrin and the Grail, learned about the affair and said nothing. Wagner's presence in Munich provoked immediate hostility from the Bavarian court and press. The composer was seen as an outsider, a spendthrift, and a dangerous influence on the impressionable young king. Rumors spread about the scale of the payments, about the nature of the relationship, about Wagner's political ambitions. Cabinet ministers grew uneasy. The public mood soured. Within months of his arrival, Wagner had become the most polarizing figure in Bavaria. Ludwig, who had expected only gratitude and beauty, was learning a harder lesson. The world did not function like an opera. Alliances had costs. Generosity provoked suspicion. And the man he admired most was also the man his court despised. The dream had already begun to fracture. Between 1865 and 1870, Munich witnessed the premieres of 4 major Wagner operas: Tristan und Isolde, Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, Das Rheingold, and Die Walküre. Ludwig funded them all. For a few brief years, Bavaria's capital was the center of European opera, but the court resented Wagner's influence. The press attacked the composer's extravagance. Ludwig was forced to ask Wagner to leave Munich in late 1865. The friendship survived. The closeness did not. The premiere of Tristan und Isolde on June 10, 1865, was a watershed. The opera had been considered unperformable, its harmonic language so radical, its emotional demands so extreme, that previous attempts at staging had collapsed. Ludwig's funding and insistence made it possible. The performance was a sensation among musicians and critics across Europe. Munich, for one evening, became the most important opera house on the continent. Ludwig sat alone in the royal box watching, but the triumph came at a price. Wagner's lifestyle in Munich, the lavish villa, the expensive tastes, the open affair with Cosima von Bülow, the wife of the conductor Hans von Bülow, had become a scandal. The Bavarian press published attacks on the composer almost daily. Cabinet ministers warned Ludwig that Wagner's influence was damaging the crown. There were even whispers that the composer was interfering in political decisions, though evidence for this was thin. Ludwig, caught between his devotion and the demands of his ministers, made the decision he had been dreading. In December 1865, he asked Wagner to leave Munich. Wagner departed for Switzerland. He settled eventually at Tribschen, near Lucerne, on the shores of Lake Lucerne. The two men continued to write to each other, long, emotional letters filled with references to the operas, to destiny, to the pain of separation. Ludwig visited Tribschen. Wagner visited Munich. But the daily closeness, the sense of shared mission, was gone. The relationship would continue for nearly 2 more decades, but it would never again be what it had been in that first year. Meanwhile, the premieres continued. Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg opened in Munich in 1868, a warm, generous opera about art, community, and the tension between tradition and innovation. Das Rheingold followed in 1869, the first part of the Ring cycle, staged against Wagner's explicit wishes because Ludwig insisted on hearing it. Die Walküre came in 1870. Each production was an event. Each was funded by the king's personal revenues, but each premiere also deepened a pattern that would define the rest of Ludwig's life. He poured money into art. His ministers objected. The press attacked. And Ludwig retreated further from the public sphere, further into the world that only music and architecture could provide. The royal box stays empty more often now. In 1866, Prussia went to war with Austria and its allies. Bavaria fought alongside Austria and lost. The terms were swift and final. Bavaria was forced into a military alliance that gave Prussia control over its foreign policy and its army in wartime. Ludwig was still king, but his sovereignty was gone. He was 21 years old and already a ruler in name only. The conflict, later called the 7 Weeks' War, was engineered by Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian minister-president, as the next step in a deliberate strategy to unify Germany under Prussian control. The pretext was a dispute over the administration of Schleswig and Holstein, territories seized from Denmark 2 years earlier. The real purpose was to break Austria's grip on the German Confederation and force the smaller German kingdoms into line. Most of the southern states, including Bavaria, sided with Austria. It was the wrong side. The war was short and brutal. The decisive blow came at the Battle of Königgrätz in Bohemia on July 3, 1866, where over 250,000 men clashed and Austria lost 40,000 casualties in a single day. In the Western Theater, Prussian forces fought against Bavaria along the Main River, shelling the fortress at Würzburg and pushing as far as Nuremberg and Frankfurt. The Bavarian army held where it could, but the outcome was never in doubt. Austria sued for peace within weeks. The Treaty of Prague, signed in August 1866, dissolved the German Confederation. Prussia annexed Hanover, Hesse-Kassel, Nassau, and Frankfurt outright. Austria was expelled from German affairs entirely. Bavaria was not annexed, but it was not free. Under a secret military alliance signed separately, Bavaria was required to place its army under Prussian command in the event of any future war. Its foreign policy was now subject to Berlin's approval. The kingdom retained its flag, its parliament, and its royal house, but the substance of power had been stripped away. For Ludwig, the defeat was not merely political, it was personal. He had believed in the sovereignty of the Bavarian crown. He had been raised to see himself as the heir to the Wittelsbachs, a dynasty that had ruled Bavaria since 1180. Now, at 21, he answered to his Prussian uncle. The medieval ideal of kingship he had grown up with, the murals at Hohenschwangau, the legends of knights who answered to no one, all of it was contradicted by the treaty on his desk. The painted walls had promised him a world where kings ruled by right. The real world took that away in 7 weeks. Ludwig continued to perform his duties, signing papers and meeting with ministers. But something shifted in that year. The public king began to retreat, and the private king began to build. The first sketches for a castle appeared 2 years later. In January 1867, Ludwig became engaged to Duchess Sophie Charlotte in Bavaria, a cousin and the younger sister of Empress Elizabeth of Austria. He postponed the wedding repeatedly. In October, he cancelled it entirely. In his final letter to Sophie, he signed off using the names of characters from Wagner's Lohengrin. He wrote that the main substance of their relationship had always been Richard Wagner's destiny. He never became engaged again. Sophie Charlotte was 21, cultured, and shared Ludwig's admiration for Wagner's music. The match seemed reasonable. The two were cousins, connected through the sprawling network of European royal families, and Sophie's sister Elizabeth was already the Empress of Austria, one of the most prominent women on the continent. Ludwig's court and his ministers had pressed for the engagement, partly because the question of succession weighed heavily on any reigning monarch without an heir. The engagement was announced on January 22, 1867, and the public received the news warmly. Portraits of the couple were circulated, and preparations began, but Ludwig delayed. The wedding date was set, then moved. Then he moved again. Weeks passed, then months. Ludwig wrote to Sophie, but his letters increasingly read like the correspondence of a man performing a role he could not inhabit. He referred to her as Elsa, the name of the heroine in Lohengrin, and signed himself Heinrich, the name of the knight. The real woman in front of him was being replaced, even in his private letters, by a character from an opera. The pressure to marry was not simply about tradition. A king without an heir left the succession uncertain. Ludwig's younger brother Otto was already showing signs of the mental illness that would later confine him permanently. If neither brother produced a successor, the Wittelsbach line would narrow dangerously. Ludwig's ministers made the point explicitly. Ludwig did not disagree. He simply could not act. By October, the engagement had been postponed so many times that it had become a source of public embarrassment. Ludwig cancelled it on October 7, 1867. In his final letter to Sophie, he made no apology for the content of the relationship. He told her plainly that their bond had always been built around Wagner and the world Wagner had created, not around anything between the two of them as people. Across Europe, royal engagements were broken occasionally, but rarely with this degree of public awkwardness. Ludwig's ministers were alarmed. The court whispered. Sophie moved on. She later married the Duke of Alençon. Ludwig never courted another woman. The question of succession, which had prompted the engagement in the first place, was left permanently unanswered. He had tried to live inside a normal life. It did not fit. In 1868, Ludwig began planning a new castle on the site of two ruined medieval fortresses above Hohenschwangau, on a ridge called the Jugend, overlooking the Paulet Gorge. He called it New Hohenschwangau. The first drawings came not from an architect, but from a stage designer named Christian Jank. The foundation stone was laid on September 5, 1869. Ludwig told Wagner he expected to move in within 3 years. The site was spectacular and almost impossible. The Jugend Ridge sat high above the village of Hohenschwangau, surrounded on 3 sides by mountain air, gorges, and dense alpine forest. To the east, the narrow Paulet Gorge cut deep into the rock, its stream running far below. To the north, the valley opened toward the Alpsee and the Schwansee, the lakes Ludwig had known since childhood. From the top of the ridge, you could see Hohenschwangau Castle directly below, the yellow walls of his father's house, the place where the painted swans still hung on the walls. Ludwig had known this spot since boyhood. His father had once planned a viewing pavilion here. The young prince had climbed the ridge often, looking out over the same mountains and lakes. Now he intended to build something far grander. In 1867, he had visited the Wartburg, the great medieval castle near Eisenach in Thuringia, recently restored in the Romanesque style. He had also traveled to France, where he toured the Château de Pierrefonds, restored by Viollet-le-Duc, and stood in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. Each visit deepened his conviction that Bavaria deserved something equally grand, and that he was the one who should build it. The choice of Christian Jank as the first designer revealed the nature of the project. Jank was not an architect. He was a theatrical set painter, trained to create illusions on stage. His initial sketches for the castle looked less like engineering drawings and more like scenes from a Wagner opera, towers and turrets rising from a craggy cliff, romantic and impossible. Ludwig loved them. He wrote to Wagner describing the plans in detail, promising that the castle would remind him of Tannhauser, of Lohengrin, of the path to the chapel in the courtyard, and the open corridors of a medieval fortress. He said the castle would be more beautiful and more livable than Hohenschwangau, which he felt had been desecrated by the presence of his mother. The architect, Eduard Riedel, was brought in to turn Jank's visions into buildable plans. The neo-Romanesque style was chosen. The ruins of the 2 old fortresses were cleared. On September 5, 1869, workers laid the foundation stone. Ludwig was 24. He believed 3 years would be enough. The mountain did not agree. Construction consumed everything. At peak activity, up to 300 workers labored on the site daily, sometimes by lamplight through the night. In the years 1879 and 1880 alone, the project used 465 tons of Salzburg marble, 1,550 tons of sandstone, and 400,000 bricks. The Gateway building was finished in 1873, and Ludwig lived there for several years. The main building, the Palace, did not reach its topping-out ceremony until 1880. The 3-year estimate had been wrong for more than a decade. The scale of the challenge was partly geological. The ridge was narrow, uneven, and exposed to harsh alpine weather. Before any walls could rise, the site had to be blasted, leveled, and reinforced. Roads had to be cut through dense forest to deliver materials. Water lines had to be laid. Each winter halted progress, and each spring revealed new damage from frost and rain. The mountain resisted the castle at every step. Ludwig insisted on overseeing every detail. He reviewed drawings, rejected proposals, and demanded revisions. The interiors were to be covered in murals depicting scenes from Wagner's operas, Tannhauser, Lohengrin, Tristan und Isolde, Parsifal, and the Nibelungen Saga. The art historian Hyacinth Holland was commissioned to design the iconographic program. 14 wood carvers would eventually spend more than 4 years on the bedroom alone, crafting the elaborate oak canopy with its rows of Gothic pinnacles. Nothing was approximate. Nothing was left to chance. The costs grew steadily. The original estimate had been 3.2 million marks. By the time of Ludwig's death, the total cost of Neuschwanstein had reached 6.18 million marks, nearly double the projection. And this was only one of Ludwig's building projects. Linderhof, in the Graswang Valley, was under construction simultaneously. Herrenchiemsee, the Bavarian Versailles on an island in Lake Chiemsee, would follow. Each project demanded its own army of craftsmen, its own supply chain, its own river of money. In 1870, a workers' insurance fund was established at the site, paid for partly by the king. 30 construction workers are recorded to have died during the building of Neuschwanstein. Their families received small pensions. The laborers came from the surrounding villages, and the project brought employment and income to a region that had little of either. The castle was both a private obsession and a local economy. Ludwig lived in the completed gateway building during the 1870s, watching the palace rise slowly beside him. The scaffolding never came down. The sound of hammers and chisels echoed across the gorge from dawn until dark. He could stand at his window and see the skeleton of his dream taking shape, year after year, wall by wall. He was building a world. The world was not finished. As Ludwig withdrew further from public life, the castle changed with him. Planned guest rooms were struck from the designs, replaced by a Moorish hall that was never built. A modest study became a colossal throne hall in Byzantine style, inspired by the Hagia Sophia. The writing room was converted into a small grotto. The building was no longer a retreat for a king who received visitors. It was a sealed world for a king who refused them. The original plans for Neuschwanstein had included well-appointed guest quarters on the upper floors, spaces designed for visitors, companions, members of the court. But as the 1870s progressed and Ludwig grew more isolated, these rooms disappeared from the blueprints. In their place, Ludwig ordered a Moorish hall complete with a fountain, inspired by the Alhambra in Granada. It was never built. The resources were not available, and the design proved incompatible with the existing structure. The space it would have occupied remained empty. The throne hall was the most dramatic change. What had originally been conceived as a modest audience room was reimagined in 1880 as a 2-story Byzantine hall, modeled on the All Saints Church in the Munich residence, and drawing heavily on the interior of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. The floor was laid with over 2 million mosaic tiles depicting animals and plants. The walls were painted with images of the 12 apostles, Christ in majesty, and the 6 canonized kings of Europe. The ceiling arched high above, gilded and painted in deep blue. A massive chandelier, shaped like a Byzantine crown, hung from the center. The room was not intended for giving audiences. It was intended as a monument to the concept of divine kingship, a space where the idea of the king mattered more than the presence of one. The throne pedestal was built. The steps were laid, but no throne was ever placed upon them. The hall was still incomplete when Ludwig was removed from the castle in 1886. It remains empty today. Elsewhere in the castle, Ludwig's private world grew stranger and more insular. The writing room was transformed into a small artificial grotto, lined with stalactites and lit by colored glass, recalling the Venus grotto he had built at Linderhof. It was a cave inside a castle, a hiding place within a hiding place. The Singers' Hall on the top floor, modeled on the Great Hall of Wartburg, was decorated with scenes from Parsifal and the legend of the Holy Grail. It was never used for performances. Ludwig sat in it alone. Each revision pulled the castle further from the world. From 1875 onward, Ludwig reversed his life. He slept through the day and woke after dark. He rode through the Bavarian forests in elaborately gilded sleighs, sometimes in medieval costume, sometimes alone for hours in the freezing cold. He ordered private performances at the Munich Court Theater, full operas staged for an audience of one. The servants lit the chandeliers. The orchestra played. The seats were empty except for the king. The sleighs were works of art in themselves. The most elaborate, a gala sleigh built by Johann Michael Meyer in 1872, was decorated with gilded cherubs bearing swords, scepters, and laurel wreaths. A crown sat at the ornamental front. From 1879 onward, the crown was fitted with an electric lamp powered by a battery hidden beneath the seat, making it one of the first electrically lit vehicles in Bavaria, possibly in the world. Ludwig's footmen rode behind the sleigh in costumes from a century earlier. The king himself wore contemporary clothing. 4 gray horses pulled the sleigh through snow-covered alpine valleys by moonlight, the electric crown glowing faintly in the dark. These rides could last for hours. Ludwig would travel the 30 kilometers between Neuschwanstein and Linderhof on dirt roads through the mountains, wrapped in furs, saying nothing. Local peasants sometimes encountered the procession and stepped aside in silence. Ludwig was known to stop and speak with them. He was not rude. He was not cold. He simply preferred the company of strangers and the dark. At the Munich Court Theater, the private performances followed a fixed ritual. Ludwig would arrive alone after the building had been emptied. The full cast performed. The full orchestra played. The lighting was set as if for a normal evening, but the auditorium held only one man. These were not rehearsals. They were complete stagings, performed at enormous expense, for a king who could not bear to share the experience with anyone else. He watched operas by Wagner, plays by Schiller, and works by other composers. He sometimes requested the same piece multiple times in a single week. By the late 1870s, Ludwig had almost entirely withdrawn from the public functions of the monarchy. He had not inspected a military parade since August 1875. He had not hosted a court banquet since February 1876. His ministers communicated with him through letters and dispatches sent to whichever mountain palace he was occupying at the time. he replied promptly. His letters were coherent, detailed, and properly composed. He was not absent from the work of governing. He was absent from the world that surrounded it. The night was his kingdom now. Neuschwanstein was not Ludwig's only project. In 1873, he purchased the Herrenchiemsee, an island in Lake Chiemsee, and began building a palace modeled on Versailles. Herrenchiemsee was the most expensive of all his buildings, costing over 16 million marks. He lived in it for only 10 days. He also completed Linderhof, a Rococo jewel with an artificial Venus grotto lit by one of Bavaria's first electric power stations. Each palace was a different escape: medieval, absolutist, mythological. None of them brought him closer to the world. Herrenchiemsee was conceived as a monument to the age of absolute monarchy and to Louis XIV of France, a king who answered to no parliament, no constitution, and no Prussian alliance. Ludwig had visited Versailles twice, in 1867 and again in 1874, and each time he returned more determined to recreate it. The new palace was built on the island's eastern shore, facing a formal garden modeled on Versailles' grounds. The Hall of Mirrors at Herrenchiemsee stretched 98 meters, slightly longer than the original in France. The state bedroom, with its bed measuring 3 meters by 2.5, was designed to surpass its French counterpart in opulence. The project began in 1878. By the time Ludwig died in 1886, only the central portion had been completed. Construction halted immediately after his death. Linderhof, by contrast, was small, intimate, and finished. Built in the Graswang Valley between 1869 and 1878, the Rococo Palace was modeled on the Petit Trianon at Versailles. It was the only one of Ludwig's 3 major palaces that he saw completed, and the only one he lived in for extended periods. The interiors were dense with gold, mirrors, silk, crystal, and porcelain. Outside, in the park, Ludwig had commissioned a Venus grotto, an artificial cave with a lake, a waterfall, and a shell-shaped boat. The grotto was lit by 24 generators, making it one of Bavaria's first electric power stations. The lighting could be adjusted to glow red, green, or the blue of the famous Blue Grotto of Capri. Ludwig would sit in the shell boat and drift across the illuminated water, alone. He also built the King's House on Schachen, a modest wooden lodge high in the mountains near Garmisch-Partenkirchen, reachable only on foot. The exterior was plain, but the upper floor contained a hall furnished in extravagant Ottoman style, complete with divans, a fountain, and richly colored textiles. Ludwig used it to celebrate his birthday and his name day in seclusion, far above the rest of the country. Each building served a different fantasy. Neuschwanstein was the medieval Grail castle. Herrenchiemsee was the palace of the Sun King. Linderhof was the Rococo dream. The King's House on Schachen was the Orient. Together, they formed a private world scattered across the Bavarian Alps, connected only by the man who moved between them in the dark. He was building faster than the money could follow. On February 13, 1883, Richard Wagner died of a heart attack in Venice. He was 69. Ludwig learned the news and withdrew further. The man who had inspired the castles, the operas, the entire fantasy kingdom, was gone. Wagner had never visited Neuschwanstein. The building had been conceived as a monument to his work, decorated floor to ceiling with scenes from his operas. Its dedicatee never walked through the door. Wagner had spent his final winter at the Ca' Vendramin Calergi, a 16th-century palazzo on the Grand Canal. He had subleased an entire floor from Count Bardi, 28 rooms, a kitchen, and service quarters. His wife Cosima was with him, along with their children and household staff. Wagner's father-in-law, the composer Franz Liszt, had visited at the end of 1882. Liszt, watching the dark funeral gondolas glide silently across the canals, was moved to compose a haunting piano piece called La Lugubre Gondola. It was as if he already knew. On the night before he died, Wagner reportedly played the Lament of the Rhine Daughters at the piano, a passage from Das Rheingold. The next morning, on February 13th, he suffered a final heart attack. He had been plagued by heart problems since at least 1873, when the stress of organizing the first Bayreuth Festival began to take its toll. His health had worsened steadily in the years since. Cosima was at his side when he died. His body was carried by a funerary gondola along the Grand Canal and then transported by overnight train to Bayreuth, where he was buried in the garden of the Villa Wahnfried, the house Ludwig had helped him build. Ludwig and Wagner had not been close in person for many years by the time of the composer's death. Wagner had left Munich in 1865. He had settled in Switzerland, then in Bayreuth. Ludwig had funded the construction of the Bayreuth Festspielhaus, the theater built specifically for Wagner's operas, but he avoided the public performances, attending only private or partial rehearsals. The two men wrote to each other, but the intensity of the early letters had faded. Wagner's attention had turned to Cosima, to Bayreuth, to the staging of Parsifal. Ludwig's attention had turned inward, toward his castles and his solitude. Still, the death struck something deep. Wagner had been the origin point. Every mural in Neuschwanstein, every painted scene of Tannhauser, Lohengrin, Parsifal, and The Ring traced back to the boy who had heard Lohengrin at 15 and never recovered. The castles were not tributes to a friendship. They were tributes to an obsession. And now the man at the center of that obsession was gone. Ludwig did not attend the funeral. He grieved alone. In May 1884, Ludwig finally moved into the completed rooms of the Palace at Neuschwanstein. He was 38. The castle was still surrounded by scaffolding. Sections remained unfinished. The throne hall had no throne. Over the next 2 years, Ludwig would spend a total of 172 days inside the building he had spent 15 years constructing. Some sources claim he slept there only 11 nights. The rooms he occupied were on the 3rd and 4th floors of the palace, the main residential wing. They included a study, a dining room, a bedroom, a small grotto, and a dressing room. The bedroom was dominated by an enormous oak bed, its canopy carved with Gothic pinnacles by 14 woodworkers over the course of more than 4 years. Light entered through tall, arched windows that looked out over the gorge, and on winter mornings, the stone walls held the cold long after the heating system had been running. The adjacent house chapel, small and vaulted, was dedicated to St. Louis, Ludwig's patron saint and the canonized King of France. The dining room was connected to the kitchen 3 stories below by a service lift. since it had proved impossible to install the disappearing table mechanism Ludwig had used at Linderhof. Every surface was covered in meaning. The murals in the study depicted the legend of Tannhauser. The dining room showed scenes of courtly love from the Wartburg tradition. The Singers' Hall on the floor above was painted with episodes from Parsifal and the search for the Holy Grail. Even the small grotto beside the study, with its artificial stalactites and colored glass lighting, was a reference to the Venusberg scene from Tannhauser. Ludwig had designed the castle as a space where every room told a different chapter of the same story, the story Wagner had set to music, the story Ludwig had been living inside since he was 15 years old. Despite its size, the castle contained no space for the royal court. There were no staterooms, no reception halls, no quarters for visiting dignitaries. The building had servant rooms and the king's private chambers. That was all. Neuschwanstein was never intended to function as a seat of government. It was a private stage built for one performer. Ludwig arrived and departed irregularly. He spent time at Linderhof, at Hohenschwangau, and occasionally at the Munich Residenz. When he was at Neuschwanstein, he wandered the rooms at night, slept during the day, and ate alone. The castle he had dreamed about since childhood, the building he had described to Wagner in long and vivid letters, the structure that had consumed 17 years and millions of marks, was a place he passed through rather than lived in. He never saw it without scaffolding. By 1885, Ludwig's personal debts had reached approximately 14 million marks, more than 3 times his annual civil list income. Foreign banks threatened to seize his properties. Ludwig refused to stop building. He commissioned plans for yet another castle, Falkenstein, and sketched ideas for a Byzantine palace and a Chinese summer lodge. He told his ministers that if creditors seized his palaces, he would kill himself. The money had always come from Ludwig's private fortune and his civil list, the annual income allocated to the crown by the Bavarian state. Contrary to widespread belief at the time and since, Ludwig did not spend state funds on his castles. The debts were personal, but they were vast. The combined cost of Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee had reached over 31 million marks by 1886. Ludwig had borrowed extensively from domestic and foreign banks to cover the shortfall. By 1885, foreign creditors were threatening legal action. If they seized royal properties, the humiliation would be international. Ludwig also received a secret income. From 1871 onward, Bismarck had arranged annual payments to the Bavarian king in exchange for Ludwig's support of the new German Empire. This money, drawn from the confiscated fortune of the deposed King of Hanover, was intended to buy Ludwig's political cooperation. Ludwig used it to fund his building projects. Even this was not enough. In early 1886, Ludwig asked his cabinet for a credit of 6 million marks. The request was denied. He followed Bismarck's advice and applied to the Bavarian parliament. The application went nowhere. Ludwig then explored increasingly desperate options, approaching foreign governments, sending emissaries to seek loans abroad, even considering a public appeal. None of these efforts succeeded. The ministers who might have helped him had already begun planning his removal. Meanwhile, Ludwig continued to commission new work. The plans for Falkenstein Castle, to be built on a rocky cliff near Fronten in the Aargau, were drawn up by the stage designer Christian Jank and later by the architect Max Schulze. The designs showed a building even more fantastical than Neuschwanstein, perched on a high precipice in the Gothic style. Ludwig also sketched ideas for a Byzantine palace in the Graswang Valley and a Chinese summer palace in Tyrol. None of these projects advanced beyond the planning stage. The money was gone. Ludwig's ministers watched the situation with growing alarm. The king was not irrational in his correspondence. His letters were clear and properly constructed. But his refusal to face the financial crisis and his insistence on building more even as the debts mounted gave his opponents exactly what they needed. The ground beneath the king was already shifting. On June 8, 1886, a commission led by Dr. Bernhard von Gudden declared Ludwig insane and unfit to rule. Gudden had never personally examined the king. The diagnosis was based on testimony from servants and court officials, collected over several months. Modern historians widely question the legitimacy of the process. The Bavarian constitution had no provision for deposing a king on grounds of mental illness. The conspiracy had been building since early 1886. Ludwig's ministers, led by Prime Minister Johann von Lutz, had decided that the king's debts, his refusal to appear in Munich, and his increasingly reclusive behavior made him a liability to the state. They needed a legal mechanism to remove him. The Constitution offered none, so they turned to medicine. Count Maximilian von Hohenstein, once a member of Ludwig's inner circle, was tasked with collecting evidence. He used bribery and his rank to extract testimony from the king's servants, many of whom had personal grievances or were secretly employed by the cabinet. The resulting dossier catalogued a long list of behaviors: Ludwig's nocturnal schedule, his habit of dining outdoors in winter, his extravagant spending, his avoidance of court functions, his private theatrical performances, and his heavy drinking. A stolen private diary provided additional material. Much of the evidence was gossip. Some of it was true. None of it had been gathered through medical observation. Gudden was a respected figure in German psychiatry. He had been professor of psychiatry at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich since 1874 and directed the state asylum. He was also the treating physician for Ludwig's brother Otto, who had suffered from severe mental illness since the age of 20. Gudden was therefore already entangled in the Wittelsbach family's medical affairs. Between January and March 1886, he compiled the witness statements into a formal psychiatric report. On June 8th, he and 3 other psychiatrists signed it. The diagnosis was paranoia, which, in the terminology of the time, meant madness. None of the 4 signatories had examined the king in person. 3 of them had never met him. A 5-year research project, conducted by the Heidelberg Academy of Sciences, later concluded that neither Gudden's report nor Ludwig's behavior provided reliable evidence of insanity. The king's letters, written up to his final days, were found to be coherent, well-argued, and impeccable in style. His handling of administrative tasks had been prompt and proper. His avoidance of public duties was attributed to lifelong social anxiety, not psychosis. But in June 1886, none of that mattered. The report existed. Prince Luitpold had agreed to serve as regent. The legal machinery was set in motion. The king was declared mad without being examined. On the night of June 10th, a government commission arrived at Neuschwanstein to arrest Ludwig. The king had been tipped off hours earlier by a loyal coachman. He ordered local police to defend him, and the commissioners were turned back at the gate. A second commission returned the following day. This time, Ludwig could not stop them. He was taken from the castle on the night of 11th to 12th June 1886. He left the building he had built for himself and never returned. The first commission arrived at approximately 4 in the morning. It included Count von Hohenstein, Dr. Gooden, and several government officials. They had traveled from Munich through the night with a formal document of deposition. But Ludwig's coachman, Fritz Osterholzer, had been tipped off and raced up the mountain path to warn the king. Ludwig ordered the local police and fire brigade to seal the castle gates. When the commissioners reached the entrance, they found armed men with bayonets drawn. They were turned away. In the confusion that followed, an unexpected figure appeared. Baroness Spera von Truxes, a 47-year-old noblewoman who lived near Hohenschwangau and was fiercely loyal to the king, attacked the commissioners with her umbrella. She forced her way into the castle, identified the conspirators by name to Ludwig, and threw herself at his feet, declaring she would protect him. Ludwig, learning that the commission had been led by men he once trusted, was furious. He ordered their arrest. The commissioners were held for several hours, then released. News of the king's situation spread quickly through the surrounding villages. Local peasants gathered at Hohenschwangau in large numbers, ready to defend Ludwig. His aide-de-camp arrived from Munich and begged him to show himself to the people, to travel to the capital, and rally public support. Bismarck reportedly offered the same advice. Ludwig refused. Others urged him to flee across the Austrian border, only a few miles from the castle. Ludwig refused again. On the night of June 11th, a second commission arrived, this time prepared for resistance. Gooden and his men entered the castle and confronted Ludwig in a corridor. The king was seized. At 4 in the morning on June 12th, he was placed in a waiting carriage. As he was led away, Ludwig reportedly asked Gooden how he could declare him insane without ever having examined him. Gooden replied that the documentary evidence was sufficient. Ludwig looked back at the White Towers one last time. The scaffolding was still up. He would never see the castle again. Ludwig was transferred to Burg Palace, a lakeside manor on the eastern shore of Lake Starnberg, about 16 miles from Munich. He was placed under the supervision of Dr. Gooden, the same man who had declared him insane. Ludwig appeared calm. He spoke quietly. He asked careful questions of everyone he encountered. He did not resist. Burg Palace was a modest structure compared to the buildings Ludwig had spent his life creating. Originally built in 1640 in the style of an Italian Renaissance villa, it had been redesigned in the neo-Gothic style by the architect Eduard Riedel in the early 1850s under Maximilian II, the same Riedel who would later work on Neuschwanstein. Ludwig knew the place well. He had used it as a summer residence for years, arriving each May and staying through the warm months. He had added a fifth tower, which he called Isolde, after the heroine of Wagner's opera. A telegraph line connected Berg to Munich. A small private harbor sat on the lake shore. The palace was comfortable, familiar, and completely isolated. Ludwig arrived in the early hours of June 12th. He was accompanied by Gudin and a team of attendants and guards. The windows of his rooms had been fitted with peepholes so that he could be observed at all times. The doors were modified to prevent him from locking himself inside. It was not a residence. It was a confinement. Yet Ludwig's behavior gave no sign of the madness the report had described. He was composed, ate breakfast, and spoke to Gudin calmly. He walked the grounds during the day, accompanied by attendants. A 5-year psychiatric study conducted decades later noted that his conduct during these final hours was entirely rational. He asked detailed questions of the staff, probing for information about how the deposition had been carried out, who had participated, and what would happen next. He was not raving. He was not confused. He was assessing the situation with clarity. That morning, Ludwig and Gudin took a supervised walk along the lake shore at around 11. Ludwig remarked that he wanted to return to the same path in the evening, without the guards. Their presence, he said, was unnecessary. Gudin, perhaps believing the king was settling into cooperation, agreed. Lake Starnberg stretched out beyond the palace grounds, wide and flat, ringed by low hills. In June, the water temperature hovered around 12 degrees Celsius. The lake was shallow near the shore, deepening gradually toward the center. A narrow path wound through the wooded park between the palace and the water's edge. The evening sky was gray. Rain had been falling earlier. On the afternoon of June 13th, Ludwig asked Gudin if they could take their walk. Gudin said yes. On the evening of June 13th, 1886, Ludwig asked Gudin to accompany him on a walk through the palace grounds, along the shore of Lake Starnberg. Gudin agreed and told the attendants not to follow. The two men were last seen at approximately 6:30 p.m. They were expected back by 8. They did not return. Ludwig had eaten a large meal that afternoon. Accounts from the kitchen described an abundant spread of food and several glasses of wine, beer, and arrack. Whether this was typical for the king or unusual is unclear. What is known is that by early evening, Ludwig was ready to go outside. He carried an umbrella. The weather had been wet. Gudin, who was 62 years old, had dismissed the police escort. His exact words were recorded, but ambiguous. He told the aides that no attendant should walk with them. Whether he meant that no one should follow at all, or that they should follow at a discreet distance, remains disputed. In either case, no one accompanied the two men as they walked into the park. The path led through a wooded stretch of the palace grounds, past tall trees and hedgerows, down toward the shore. The light was fading. The lake was calm. Gendarmes patrolling the perimeter of the park reported seeing and hearing nothing unusual. At 6:30 p.m., Ludwig and Gudin were glimpsed walking together near the water. After that, they vanished from sight. By 8 p.m., when the pair had not returned, the household staff grew alarmed. Dr. Franz Karl Müller, a psychiatrist on Gudin's team, organized a search. The entire castle staff fanned out through the grounds. Rain was falling heavily. The wind had picked up. It took more than 2 hours to find them. At approximately 10:30 p.m., the bodies of both men were discovered in the lake near the shore. The water where they lay was shallow, barely waist deep. Ludwig was found floating face down, his coat unbuttoned, with Gudden's body nearby. His watch had stopped at 6:54 p.m. Gudden's watch had stopped at 8 p.m., more than an hour later. Gudden's body showed marks on his neck and forehead consistent with a struggle. Attempts at resuscitation failed. Ludwig was 40 years old. He had been king for 22 years. He had spent the last day of his life inside a palace he had not built, on the shore of a lake he had known since childhood. No one saw what happened near the water. At 10:30 p.m., after more than 2 hours of searching in a heavy rainstorm, the bodies of both Ludwig and Gudden were found in the lake. The water where they lay was barely waist deep. Ludwig's watch had stopped at 6:54 p.m. The official ruling was suicide by drowning, but the autopsy found no water in Ludwig's lungs. He had been a strong swimmer. Gudden's body showed signs of a struggle. No one else was present. No one heard anything. The autopsy was performed at the Munich residence on June 15th, 2 days after the death. The pathologist, Professor Nikolaus Rudinger, found no external injuries on Ludwig's body, no gunshot wounds, no stab marks, no abrasions on the face or neck. Drowning could not be proven conclusively, partly because of the resuscitation attempts that had been performed at the scene. The report noted that a heart attack or circulatory collapse was also possible. Ludwig's abdominal girth was recorded at 120 centimeters, evidence of the weight he had gained in his final years. He had entered the water in full clothing, overweight, in 12-degree water, after a heavy meal and several glasses of alcohol. No formal autopsy was conducted on Gudden, at the request of his family. But eyewitnesses who handled the body reported visible marks on his neck, consistent with choking or a violent struggle. The most widely accepted reconstruction holds that Ludwig attempted to flee across the lake, that Gudden tried to stop him, and that a physical confrontation occurred in the shallows. Ludwig may have subdued or killed Gudden before succumbing himself, either to drowning, to a heart attack brought on by exertion and cold water, or to some combination of both. Other theories have persisted for more than a century. Some believe Ludwig was assassinated by agents of the Bavarian government, who feared he might rally public support and reverse the deposition. Others have suggested that an escape had been arranged, with a boat waiting on the far shore, and that the plan went wrong. In 1933, Ludwig's personal fisherman, Jakob Liedl, reportedly claimed on his deathbed that he had witnessed the events and had been pressured into silence by the government. His account has never been independently verified. The questions were never answered. On August 1st, 1886, Neuschwanstein was opened to the paying public. The castle Ludwig had built as a private sanctuary, a place no outsider was ever supposed to enter, became a museum less than 2 months after his death. The name was changed from New Hohenschwangau to Neuschwanstein. The king had never used that name. He had never chosen it. The decision to open the castle came from Prince Regent Luitpold, Ludwig's uncle, who had assumed power on June 10th. The motives were partly financial. Ludwig's debts, which had reached 14 million marks, needed to be addressed. The castles, built entirely from personal funds, were now assets of the royal estate. Opening them to paying visitors was the most direct way to begin recovering the costs. The very buildings that had driven the king to ruin would now be expected to pay for themselves. The public responded immediately. From the first weeks, visitors came in large numbers, drawn by the story of the king's death and the allure of the unfinished castle perched on its alpine cliff. The name Neuschwanstein, meaning New Swan Stone, was applied after Ludwig's death as a tribute to the swan imagery that had defined both the castle and the king's identity. Ludwig had always called it New Hohenschwangau. The renaming stripped even his name for the building from the record. Only about 14 of the more than 200 planned rooms had been completed. The bower, the southern wing of the castle, was finished in a simplified form in 1891. The square tower was completed in 1892. The keep and the chapel, which Ludwig had planned as crowning elements, never advanced beyond the foundation stage. They were never built. The castle that visitors walk through today is a partial structure, a fraction of what the king had envisioned, frozen at the moment its creator was removed. During the Second World War, the castle was used by the Nazi regime as a storage facility for art looted from across Europe, part of the operation known as the Rosenberg Task Force. Crates of stolen paintings, sculptures, and cultural artifacts were catalogued inside the rooms Ludwig had designed for silence and solitude. Allied forces liberated the castle in 1945. After the war, Neuschwanstein returned to its role as a public museum. The Wittelsbach family had formally transferred the castles to the Bavarian state in 1923 through Ludwig III's son, Crown Prince Ruprecht. The building Ludwig had intended for himself alone now belonged to everyone. He had locked the doors. The world opened them anyway. The throne hall at Neuschwanstein was never completed. The mosaic floor was finished. The painted arches were in place, but the throne itself was never installed. The pedestal stands empty. It has remained empty for more than a century. The room meant to celebrate the authority of a king became the largest monument to what he never had. The hall occupies the third and fourth floors of the palace and was added to the plans in 1880, relatively late in the castle's design. It replaced a modest audience room that Ludwig no longer wanted. By then, he was not building for visitors or for governance. He was building for an idea. The room was conceived as a shrine to the principle that kings were chosen by God, not by parliaments, not by constitutions, and not by Prussia. Every surface declared it. The painted kings on the walls, the archangel above the apse, the deep blue ceiling with its golden stars. All of it pointed upward, toward heaven, toward a source of authority that no treaty could revoke. The throne was designed but never fabricated. Sketches show an elaborate gold and ivory seat raised on a stepped platform at the far end of the hall, flanked by palm trees and candelabras. The steps were built. The platform was laid. But the chair that was supposed to sit at the top was never made. Whether this was due to lack of funds, lack of time, or some deeper hesitation on Ludwig's part is not known. What is known is that the most important seat in the most personal building Ludwig ever conceived was left empty. Visitors today walk through the throne hall and see the platform with its steps leading to nothing. It is the most photographed room in the castle. It is also the most honest. The hall was built for a king who believed he ruled by divine right. The empty pedestal tells the truth. He did not. The room waits for a king who will never come. Ludwig's successor was his younger brother Otto, who had been confined since 1883 due to severe mental illness. Otto was declared king, but never ruled. Their uncle Luitpold served as regent until his own death in 1912. The House of Wittelsbach, which had governed Bavaria since 1180, would lose the throne entirely in 1918. Ludwig's line produced no heirs. The dynasty ended. Otto had been showing signs of mental illness since his early 20s. He had served in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, and the experience appears to have worsened his condition. By the late 1870s, he was unable to attend public functions. By 1883, he was placed under permanent medical supervision at Fürstenried Palace, south of Munich. His treating physician was Dr. Bernhard von Guden, the same man who would later declare Ludwig insane and die alongside him in Lake Starnberg. When Ludwig died on June 13, 1886, Otto technically became King of Bavaria. But he never performed a single act of government. He never signed a document. He never appeared in public. The regency of Prince Luitpold, which had been established on June 10th to replace Ludwig, simply continued. Luitpold governed Bavaria as regent for the next 26 years, maintaining a stable, if unremarkable, administration. He died in 1912 at the age of 91. His son, Ludwig III, then briefly became king in his own right, the last king Bavaria would ever have. The end came in November 1918. As the First World War collapsed around the German Empire, revolution swept through Munich. On November 7th, the socialist leader Kurt Eisner declared Bavaria a republic. Ludwig III fled. The Wittelsbach dynasty, which had governed Bavaria without interruption for over 700 years, was finished. Otto, still confined at Fürstenried, was formally deposed along with his cousin. He died in 1916, though by that point his kingship had been a legal fiction for 3 decades. Ludwig II had left no children. His broken engagement to Sophie Charlotte in 1867 was the last time marriage had been seriously discussed. Otto, confined and incapacitated, had no descendants either. The Wittelsbach line continued through other branches of the family, but the direct succession from Ludwig's father, Maximilian II, ended with 2 brothers. One dead in a lake, the other locked in a palace he never chose. Today, Franz, Duke of Bavaria, the head of the House of Wittelsbach, uses Berg Palace as a private residence. The memorial cross still stands in the shallows. The family endures. The crown does not. Today, more than 1.3 million people visit Neuschwanstein each year. On peak summer days, 6,000 tourists pass through its doors. The castle inspired Walt Disney's Sleeping Beauty Castle and became the logo for Walt Disney Pictures. In 2025, it was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The building that nearly bankrupted its creator has generated billions of euros for the Bavarian state. The transformation from private ruin to global landmark began almost immediately after Ludwig's death. The public fascination with the king's story, the mystery of his death, the extravagance of his buildings, and the romance of his isolation turned Neuschwanstein into one of the most visited structures in Europe within a few decades. By 1914, the castle was estimated to be the single largest source of income for the Wittelsbach family. By the end of the 20th century, it was one of the most photographed buildings in the world. Walt Disney and his wife Lillian visited Neuschwanstein during a European tour in the 1950s. Disney was struck by the castle's silhouette, its white towers rising above the forest against the backdrop of the Alps. He used it as the direct model for Sleeping Beauty's castle, the centerpiece of Disneyland when it opened in 1955. The image was later adapted into the Walt Disney Pictures logo, seen at the opening of every Disney film. A castle, built by a reclusive king who wanted no visitors, became the most recognizable symbol of a company built on fantasy and spectacle. The UNESCO inscription in 2025 recognized Neuschwanstein alongside Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, and the King's House on Schachen as a serial World Heritage Site. The citation described them as places of seclusion designed under the meticulous supervision of Ludwig II, built as total works of art that made full use of the stylistic trends and technical possibilities of their era. The language was careful and respectful. It did not mention insanity. It did not mention debt. The economics of the castle have long since reversed Ludwig's financial disaster. Tourism revenue from Neuschwanstein and Ludwig's other palaces has returned many times over the cost of their construction. The castles that were built to be private have become among the most public buildings in Germany. The rooms Ludwig designed for solitude are now walked through by thousands of strangers every day, in guided tours that last 30 minutes, in languages he never spoke. The castle stands on its cliff above the Polet Gorge, white against the mountains, visible from miles away. The scaffolding is finally gone. The towers are clean. The Marienbrücke, the steel bridge Ludwig had built over the gorge in 1886, the last year of his life, now serves as the most popular viewpoint for photographs. Tourists stand on it and look across at the castle, framing it against the sky, unaware that the man who built it never once stood where they are standing and saw it the way they see it now. It was built for one. Millions come instead. On the eastern shore of Lake Starnberg, a small iron cross stands in the shallow water where Ludwig's body was found. A memorial chapel overlooks the site from the hillside above. Every year on June 13th, people gather there. They bring flowers. They stand in silence. No one knows exactly what happened in the lake that night. Ludwig once told his governess that he wished to remain an eternal mystery. He got his wish. The cross rises from the lake bed a few meters from the shore, in water that barely reaches a grown man's waist. It is a simple structure, dark iron against the surface of the water, marking the approximate spot where Ludwig and Gudrun were pulled from the shallows on the night of June 13, 1886. A small wooden sign nearby identifies the site. There is no grand monument. There is no statue of the king. The restraint of the memorial seems fitting for a man whose story resists simple conclusions. The votive Kapelle, the memorial chapel built 3 years after Ludwig's death, stands on the wooded hillside above the cross. It is a small, quiet building, its interior decorated with simple frescoes. Every year on the anniversary of Ludwig's death, a remembrance ceremony is held. locals and admirers gather at the lakeside. Some carry candles. Some lay wreaths on the water. The ceremony is not organized by the state. It is maintained by devotion, passed down through generations of Bavarians who still call Ludwig der König, their king. In the crypt of St. Michael's Church in the center of Munich, Ludwig's body rests in a stone sarcophagus alongside other members of the Wittelsbach dynasty. His heart, removed according to royal Bavarian tradition, lies in a silver urn at the shrine of Our Lady of Altotting, next to the hearts of his father and grandfather. Even in death, he was divided, his body in Munich, his heart in Altotting, his memory scattered across the castles and lakes and mountains of Bavaria. The questions about his death have never been resolved. No trial was held. No formal investigation was conducted. The Bavarian government moved quickly to close the matter, suppressing witness testimony and sealing records. Historians have debated for over a century whether Ludwig drowned, suffered a heart attack, was murdered, or died during a failed escape. The fisherman's deathbed confession, the marks on Gudden's neck, the absence of water in Ludwig's lungs, the stopped watches. Each detail points in a different direction. None of them point to certainty. Ludwig told his governess, years before any of this, that he wanted to remain an eternal mystery to himself and to others. The lake kept his secret. The scaffolding is gone now. It took 6 more years after Ludwig's death to finish even a simplified version of the southern wing. The keep was never built. The chapel was never built. The Moorish hall, the knight's bath, the guest rooms on the upper floors, all of it stayed on paper. What stands on the cliff today is a fraction of what Ludwig intended. The castle is complete only in the sense that no one is still working on it. Inside, the rooms he occupied remain as they were. The oak bed with its carved Gothic canopy. The small grotto is lined with artificial stalactites. The dining room with its service lift descending 3 stories to a kitchen that no longer cooks for a king. The murals of Tannhauser and Lohengrin and Parsifal still cover the walls, their colors vivid, their stories unchanged. The Singers' Hall on the top floor, modeled on the Wartburg, still holds its painted scenes of the Holy Grail. No performance was ever staged there. The chairs remain empty. The acoustics have never been tested by music. The throne hall is still the largest room in the building. The mosaic floor still gleams. The chandelier still hangs from the vaulted blue ceiling. The steps still lead up to the platform where a golden throne was supposed to sit. The platform is bare. It has been bare for more than a century. No one has placed anything on it. No one has filled the space. The absence has become the point. Outside, the Polet Gorge still drops away beneath the Marienbrücke. The Alpsee still reflects the mountains. The air at this altitude still thins and cools in the late afternoon. Tourists cross the bridge and photograph the castle from the same angle, thousands of times a day, in every season. They see the white walls, the towers, the forest pressing in on all sides. They see a building that looks as if it has always been there, as if it belongs to the mountain. It does not. It belongs to one man. He is not here. Ludwig's heart rests in a silver urn at Altotting. His body lies in the crypt of St. Michael's Church in Munich. His castle stands on the cliff above Hohenschwangau, open to strangers every day of the year, visited by more than 1 million people annually, none of whom he would have allowed inside. The Iron Cross still stands in the shallow water at Lake Starnberg. Flowers still appear at its base on the 13th of June. The chapel on the hill still holds its silence. He built the castle to disappear into, and he vanished before it was finished. 61 million people have walked through the rooms he made for himself alone. The throne was never placed, the chapel was never built, and the king never returned. He slept in it only for 11 nights.